Welcome everyone. Today's agronomics webinar topic is Advances in Crop System Modeling, DSSAT Evolution, and Climate-Smart Agricultural Applications. As you know, I'm Berk Üstündağ from International Society of Agromatics and Istanbul Technical University. First of all, I suggest non-ISAM member participants to be registered to ISAM through www.agromatics.org so that they can be informed about activities of the agromatics community and take the agromatics society's other future benefits. I'm delighted that we have valuable participants in today's webinar. And now, please keep your microphones muted. Questions may be asked anytime by utilizing the chat function here in the Zoom. I'll take this opportunity to introduce you Professor Gerrit Hoogenboom. And Professor Hoogenboom is preeminent scholar in the Global Food Systems Institute and Professor of Agriculture and Biological Engineering at University of Florida. He was the former director of Agriculture WeatherNet program while Professor of Agrometeorology at Washington State University, and he has over 30 years of experience in research and education in agriculture and environmental engineering. Since year 2019, he is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Agricultural Science, and he was elected as fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science in 2022. Thank you for your acceptance for your presentation here in Agromatics Society, Gerrit. You're welcome.
Thank you. It's quite an honor to be invited to present. I noticed there are several people on this seminar who I've met before. So what I decided to is give a general overview of DSSAT and crop modeling and some specific applications. So some of the slides I will be presenting, some of you might already have seen, so my apologies. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it clearly.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So as we all know, agriculture is really from a farmer perspective, a very risky business. Farmers have to deal with weather variability on a day-to-day basis, on a seasonal basis, even on a spatial basis. And they also have to deal with extreme events anywhere in the globe. They have to deal with unexpected pest outbreaks, which can be handled with pesticides, but again, there's an economic cost involved. They have to deal with production costs, especially fertilizer prices can be extremely volatile, as we have seen a couple of years ago with the war in Ukraine. The grain prices itself can be very volatile. And last but not least, governmental policies can change on a heartbeat, especially what we have seen recently in the United States. So this really is something that the farmers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So given that farming is a risky business, then the question I would like to pose, can we use computer models to help, first of all, understand the interaction between the genotype, so that's what we call the cultivar and the particular crop, the environment, especially when we talk about weather conditions and soil conditions, and then also look at management interactions. And then can we use computer models to see if we can help reduce the uncertainty and risk associated, especially with on the climate variability and climate change, given still the other factors that cannot be controlled by farmers to some extent. So why do we want to work with models? So traditionally, and again, I don't know much about the background of the people on this seminar, but if you look at agriculture research, we refer to this the experimental trial and error approach. Across the globe, agronomists are conducting trials. Normally, these are replicated trials. These are conducted for at least 2 different years, so we can handle the weather variability associated with the changes in conditions. But then if we want to take this information one step further, which is really ultimately the goal of agriculture research, we want to translate this into information that can be used by a farmer. And we all know that if we have conducted an experiment in 2024 and 2025, there's no guarantee that the farmers will see the same type of conditions if we actually make recommendations for 2023. So really what I'm proposing here is then a systems approach, and many of you who are on the call are probably already familiar with, where we can integrate the experimental data with what we call computer models. And ultimately, what we are interested in is first of all, understand how the crops or even livestock respond to different conditions, weather conditions, soil conditions, crop management, etc. How we can then look at how we can predict this system, and ultimately how we can look at providing options to farmers for control and management. So ultimately, when we look at agriculture research, this is what agriculture research is all about. Yes, we want to have publication in referee journal articles, but ultimately we want to provide information to farmers and provide them what we call options for adaptive management, to look at risk reduction, and ultimately also look at short and long-term economic and environmental sustainability. So in this systems approach, really, we are looking at experimental data. We can develop a model, and in my case, we're working with crop simulation models, but this can also be a statistical model, or it can even be an AI model, which is currently somewhat of interest to many people. We can then use this model to make predictions. We might have to conduct more experiment to test these predictions. This will really result in increased understanding, and again, will identify what we call research gap to further enhance our modeling approach. But at the same time, we can use the same information then into what we call a decision support system to help control and manage and provide the actionable information to farmers to solve real-world problems. So when we talk about the agricultural system, and hopefully many people are familiar with the crop we're looking at, it's not only about genetics, it's not only about soil physics, it's not only about soil chemistry, it's not only about agricultural engineering, it's also not only about agriculture, agrometeorology. Here we're looking at a rice plant that has been. Can you please mute your microphone? Sorry. So what we're looking at here is a rice system that's grown under flooded conditions, and we see many boxes here, we see many arrows, etc. So all these boxes represent the different processes we really have to understand in order to provide these decisions to a farmer. So we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking about transpiration, we're talking about water uptake, we're looking at changes in the soil process, etc. So to really do a good job, we need to develop these comprehensive model that really can help us address this complex agricultural system. So the crop simulation models we are working with are really what we call interdisciplinary. We cannot just look at one component of the agricultural system. We need to look at the different components. They also have to be collaborative. I mean, we cannot be experts in soil physics, soil chemistry, inbreeding, etc. So we really need to work across the different disciplines within agriculture. So in order then to be able to make these predictions, we really need to develop models that integrate the current state of the art of scientific knowledge as it is related to many different disciplines or subdisciplines within the agricultural domain, looking at crop physiology, bleeding agronomy, agrometeorology, etc. So I already mentioned many of these earlier. And really what we're ultimately interested again in agriculture is to provide advisories using various type of products. We can look at big data products. We can look at system-based models embedded in the decision support system to first of all understand what the outcomes are when we make different recommendations and options, and then ultimately provide what we call actionable information to our stakeholders. So again, to simplify it a little bit with respect to these crop simulation models, the model shown here in the center is the box. That is, requires daily weather data as input. It requires soil information as input. It requires genetic information as input, not only at the crop level, but also at the cultivar or variety level, because we know that different cultivars or varieties have different responses, such as short day and long day crops, and shorter season and longer season varieties. We need to look at management inputs, such as the amount and timing of irrigation events, the amount and types and the timing of fertilizer events, etc. And within this model, we first of all need to be able to predict what we call development. So we need to be able to, over time, predict when flowering occurs, when seed filling begins, and when ultimately then harvest maturity occurs. In parallel, we're looking at predicting photosynthesis processes, we're looking at biomass partitioning among the different plant components, and these two need to be integrated, both plant development and plant growth, to ultimately predict yield. But within the agricultural system, it's not only about yield. As I showed in my introduction slide, it is also about economics. So we need to be aware that when we make a recommendation with respect to changes in fertilizer application amounts or irrigation, there is a cost involved. So we also need to look at the net income. In addition, with respect to these crop models, it's not only about yield prediction, but it's also about the environmental impact. Especially today, we are not only interested in increasing yield, but we're also interested in reducing the impact in the environment. So just here in Florida, where we have very sandy soils, we have a lot of rainfall events. So when people apply fertilizer, there's a high risk that the nitrogen fertilizer might leach to the groundwater. So we need to look at the environmental impact. Equivalent to that is we're also now looking at greenhouse gas emissions, which have become very important, and we know that agriculture is a keen contributor to greenhouse gas emission. And we also need to look at resource use, especially as it relates to irrigation management. So there's going to be an optimum between the amount of water we apply, the amount of water that is available to apply, and then the yield response. So the focus of my presentation, as was shown earlier in the title, really is what we call the DSSAT crop modeling system, and we now refer to it more as a DSSAT crop modeling ecosystem. It has a fairly long history. It started in the 1980s through a project funded by the US Agency for International Development. Unfortunately, this no longer exists. This was a 10-year project looking at food security with focus on the developing countries. So in this project, the original models, what we call the series maize model, the series wheat model, series rice, soy grow, and peanut grow, which some of you might be familiar with, were brought under the umbrella of the DSSAT system. Although the project ended in 1993, the development of DSSAT has continued, mainly as a volunteer effort. And about a year ago, in December of 2024, we released the most recent version, what we call 4.8.5. The original software was actually sold for $495, as we can see here. Some of you might have seen this very old media that was being used, floppy diskettes, the largest diskettes and the largest diskettes. We even moved to CD-ROM, but ultimately decided it was not structured as maintainable. So we decided to go to completely free download. We went even one step further. We made the source codes completely open domain in what we call a 3-clause BSD license, which means that the models can even be used for commercial applications as well. And the DSSAT can be downloaded through a request on the DSSAT portal, www.dsat.net. So again, we call this a DSSAT ecosystem. So first of all, we have a core of crop simulation models. We currently have models for over 45 different crops. We deal not only with food production, but also with feed production, with fiber and fuel and vegetables. But really, the DSSAT system is built on a very large community, first of all, of model users that really motivate us as developers to continue to maintain this system. There's also a fairly large community of trainers across the globe who provide training to other people on how to use the software. So as many of you know, we've worked with models. This requires tools and utilities for data preparation. So that's part of the DSSAT system, as well as tools for applications as well, so we can address real-world problems. This is enough an overview, and this map hasn't been updated for the last 6 months, but we have a download request from over 190 countries and territories across the globe, with close to or more than 38,000 requests. It doesn't really mean that people are really using it, but at least they've requested a copy of the software. So there's been strong interest, especially in India, China, Pakistan, Brazil, and many other countries as shown in this map. Again, for those of you familiar with DSAT or working with it, this is the most recent shell. So really, it's geared towards the running the simulation models, the tools shown on the left for data entry, as well as the application programs. And many people refer to DSAT as the model, and I really want to emphasize the model underneath DSAT is called the Cropping System Model. DSAT itself is just a shell, an interface that allows us to provide access to various tools for data preparation, as well as the application programs to look at single season applications, to look at crop rotations, spatial applications, climate change, and in-season yield forecasting. Another aspect that is very critical of our crop modeling system that we provide real data that were used for the development of the crop models. So these are all part of the shell as well. So anytime we add a new model for a new crop to DSAT, it includes at least 2 experiments with the experimental data, with weather data, with soil data, with the genetics, and especially with observations to show how the model performs when we run it for those particular experiments. So within the cropping system model, as I mentioned earlier, it was based on the original models called series maize, series wheat, soy grow, and peanut grow. But already in the early days, we came to the conclusion that when we look at a farming system, it's not only about one crop, it's about multiple crops. And when crops are being grown on soil, the soil physical characteristics, the soil chemical characteristics, etc., don't really change if we grow a maize crop, a soybean crop, a wheat crop, or a rice crop. So that's why we decided to combine these various models into a much larger model, a cropping system model, where the models basically run the same soil water dynamics, soil nitrogen dynamics, soil organic carbon dynamics, and soil phosphorus dynamics. We have the same modules to read the input files. We have the same modules that handle the weather data, etc. However, what is different is what we call the plant modules. So still within the DSAT cropping system model, you can find a separate model for series maize. There's one for sorghum called series sorghum. And then to the left, on parallel to that, for the grain legumes, we're using what we call the crop growth template. It also has been extended to deal with vegetables, to deal with fiber crops such as cotton, and currently we're even developing a model for tree crops, especially for citrus, which is originally also based on the crop growth template. So again, in order to run crop simulation models, and many of you are familiar with this, it does require input data. So we need to have the daily weather data, the soil characteristics, the cultivar characteristics to some extent, and the management data. And already from the early days from DSAT, we've been trying to emphasize what is called a minimum data set in order to run these models. That means a data set that can be relatively easy collected or obtained by experimental researchers, but also ultimately give us reasonable answers when we run these crop simulation models. One of the challenges when we work with these crop simulation models is really the characteristics of local varieties, because we are unable to provide that information in the DSAT system because varieties are released on a continuous basis. So the models do need to be calibrated with local data to obtain the characteristics of local varieties, and also we need to do some type of independent evaluation with another data set for the same region. But once we've done that, these models become very powerful to help us address what-if questions and to ultimately provide information, what we call actionable information for climate-smart agriculture. Some agronomists think that models and currently also AI might take over agriculture research, but we have continued to find, especially with our crop models, that there's still large knowledge gaps in the literature, requiring that we need to conduct more experiment to help improve our crop simulation models. So at least from the crop modeling perspective, experimental data continue to be very, very critical to be able to do a very good job in simulating the very challenging agricultural system. So here's an example of the simulation of a very old experiment that was conducted at the University of Florida in 1978. And many of you might already have seen this graph. We also show it in our crop modeling workshops. But basically on the x-axis you see day of year, on the y-axis you see dry weight. The line's gonna basically represent the daily simulations of a soybean model in this case, and the symbols represent the observed data points. So the red and the green line represent above ground biomass, the blue and the black line represent the grain yield. So we can see that the model in this case does do a very good job simulating these very detailed observations. With respect to model applications, there's a whole range of applications, and I'm unable to cover many of these, so I'll show you some examples. So the original models really were developed to look at yield gap analysis, and that has transitioned now even to looking at precision agriculture. So we can looking at yield variations within a field. We have sufficient input information, and then also prescribe spatially variable management. These models have been used extensively for irrigation management as well as water use projections for the future. In parallel to that, also looking at soil fertility management, looking at breeding applications. And of course, also in the climate area, they've been looked at adaptive management for climate forecasts, looking at climate variability, climate change, and associated with that, so carbon sequestration. We've looked at land use change analysis, early warning system, and even other aspects such as biofuel production and recently risk insurance. Again, these crop models are not the sole answer to the future when we're looking at providing actionable information. So we really see opportunities for linkages between AI systems to linkages with remote sensing, really to do a better job in providing farmers with actionable information at the right time and at the right place. So extend on the applications of the DSSAT system itself. A couple of years ago, I had a visiting scientist from India who did a meta-analysis of the applications of DSSAT in South Asia and China. And he found about 205 papers that were published between 2010 and 2022. And many of these papers showed a very reasonable performance of the model. So what you see here is the wheat model, the rice model, and the maize model. The top panels represent the predictions of flowering date and maturity date, with the observed data on the x-axis and simulated data on the y-axis. On the bottom panels, you see the predictions for above ground biomass and for yield. So again, you can see that the models did a very good job for a whole range of environments for predicting yield for these crops.
Excuse me, Gerrit, could you please return to previous slide?
Yes.
Did you measure the amount of days after sowing or plantation until maturity, or how did you match the observed and the simulated parameters?
Okay, these are all studies. They were not conducted by me. They were conducted by scientists in many different countries in South Asia and China. I mean, 205 papers. So in each of these studies, the researchers basically went into the field and they did observe the flowering date of these crops. They did observe the maturity date of these crops. So, and they had the accurate management information. They had daily weather data and soil data. So that information was used as input into the crop models. did have to do some adjustment of the genetic coefficients, but after these adjustments, they were able to predict the flowering date and maturity date correctly for wheat, for rice, and maize for those countries and environments.
Okay, so in the lower graphs, they found the correlation, they calculated the correlation for the grain and biomass, it is clear, and for the above ones, they had
Yeah.
investigation related to phenological stage transitions.
Yeah. So and this again, my visiting scientist extracted this information from these 205 papers. Okay, so he went in there and basically extracted the flowering date, the maturity date of all those papers and put them in the graph. So each of these points represent a different experiment conducted at a different location under different management conditions. So this is the ultimate result of this meta-analysis of the model. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, there are quite high R-square values.
Yeah. So this is quite amazing to see this performance of these models for these different environments. Okay, let me show you a few other examples. So the first one is relates back to where I'm from, southeastern United States. So you see 3 states here. You see Florida on the southern part, the state of Georgia and the state of Alabama. So the question is, why should farmers actually care about climate? So here we talk about current climate. So what we did is, and many of you hopefully are familiar with that as well, El Niño, La Niña. So we have quite a strong signal in the southeastern United States. So what you see on the left is what we call the neutral near. So there's no specific signal with respect to the temperature of the Pacific Ocean. So these little areas represent different counties. So these are political districts. So green color means that there is an increase in yield compared to long-term yield. And this is observed. This is not simulated. Red means there's a decrease in yield. For the El Nino years, you see in most counties a decrease in yield due to the red colors as shown here. In the La Nina years, there is an increase in yield. So we know that the ENSO phases are predictable because this is based on the temperature of the Pacific Ocean around the equator. And here's an example. And we also know that, for instance, for La Nina or El Nino, that the impact is different across the globe. So in some cases it's warm, in some places it's cold, some places wet, and some places are dry. But it is all predictable. So this is quite interesting. And it's predictable that with respect that we can provide information to the farmers at least 3 months ahead of time. So as part of this research activity, then we tried to determine if there was an impact of the ENSO phases on peanut production and other crops in the southeastern United States. So the green areas here represent the counties where peanut is being grown in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. So we evaluate 9 different planting dates. We looked at rain-fed versus irrigated conditions. In this case, we had a range of historical weather data available from 38 years to 107 years. And for each county, we had 3 what we call representative soil profiles. So we use that information as input into our crop models. So for each unique combination, planting date, year, and soil, we had a prediction for yield. So you can see here the outcomes of these predictions, and we're using box and whisker plots and using the yield deviation from neutral. So each of these box and whisker plots is a combination of all these yield outcomes. So you can see on the top we have the El Nino response, on the bottom we have the La Nina response, and rain-fed and irrigated conditions. So if we look at rain-fed conditions for El Nino, which is the left top, we can see that there's no real impact of planting date, which is shown on the y-axis, both for rain-fed conditions and irrigated conditions. However, if you look at La Nina, on the rain-fed conditions, there's in general a decrease in yield the later we look at the planting date. And again, for irrigated conditions, there is not much impact. Now, this is a box and whisker plot, which we as scientists understand, but it is very challenging to represent this to a farmer. So we developed a web portal, which is called agroclimate.org, already quite a few years ago, We first of all show the projections for long-term climate outlooks in the United States, and this is already old. I haven't had a chance to update this. But what really is key is how we provide this information now to farmers. So in the early days, when we talked to the farmers using social scientists, actually, they told us that they were not interested in yield, but they knew the yield, long-term yield for the field. What they really wanted to know was the probability of the yield would increase or decrease as a function of planting date. So we basically developed this interface. So on the left top, you can see the crop you can select. You can select the type of variety. You can select the state, such as Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. You can select the county, you can select your soil, and then the different planting dates. And on the right, then you see the probability distribution. And in this case, again, we're not showing yield, we're showing net returns with probabilities. So here we see an evaluation of 3 planting dates, May 15, May 29, and June 12. It seems that the June 12 planting date might be better with respect to the probabilities. So this is based on not running the models instantaneously, but conducting long-term historical weather simulations, similar to what I showed you in the previous slide, storing this information in a database. So when farmers access this or extension access this, they get an immediate response, so they don't have to wait. So the second one I want to talk about, of course, is climate change, and all of you are familiar with climate change. You've seen the IPCC report. You've seen on the left the projections of the increase in temperatures. And again, I want to emphasize that temperature in most countries has a negative impact on yield, but again, to some extent, CO2 actually has a positive impact on yield. And all know that concentration of CO2 is increasing over time, as shown here in this graph. So I was involved in an AgMap project, and maybe some of you on the call might be familiar with this. This is an agriculture model in comparison and improvement project. It's very similar to what is being done by the IPCC with respect to the global climate models. So here we're not only looking at evaluating one crop model, but looking at multiple crop models. And the question really is for integrated assessment, first of all, to understand what is the sensitivity of the current agricultural system to climate change? What are the benefits of intervention? So it's not only negative, but it also could be positive both on the current systems as well as future systems. So in my case, as part of this activity, I was involved in a case study in Punjab, Pakistan, where we were mainly focused on the wheat rice system. And we know that both in India and in Pakistan, a very large community relies on the production in this region. And we also know, especially India and Pakistan have been extremely vulnerable to climate change and extreme events. And just shown here, we see the increase in temperature for rice during the rice growing season shown on the left, and the wheat growing season shown here on the right. So we know that the climate has been changing. So part of this activity, first of all, again, experimental data were obtained by my colleagues in Pakistan from about 155 farmers. And in this research project, we used actually 2 different crop models, not only DSSAT, but also EPSIM, which has been developed in Australia. We used the outcomes of 5 general circulation models using RCP 8.5, and then that information again was linked to an economic model. As I mentioned earlier, it's not only about yield, but it's really ultimately about economic sustainability and vulnerability. So many of you might have seen these types of graphs already. So again, this is the box and whisker plot showing the response of the EPSIM wheat model on the left, DSSAT wheat model on the right. So we have what we call current climate condition baseline, which is the red box and whisker plots, and the 5 very colorful box and whisker plots represent different GCMs. So we can see that the EPSIM model shows a decrease in yield, but it shows the same response for all the GCMs, while the DSSAT model is much more sensitive and again shows a decrease in future yield projection for this particular climate change scenario. And you see the same for rice. On the left, you see the EPSIM model. Again, not much sensitivity. The DSAT model is much more sensitive to these different outcomes of the DCM models. So in general, we found that for rice production, DSAT predicted a decrease of 15.2, APSIM 17.2, and the same for wheat. And again, we don't really need to run these models to come to these conclusions currently. But what really becomes more interested is how what the type of adaptation practices we can implement to see how we can basically make sure that we still have sustainable food production in the future. So we evaluated different planting dates. We looked at changing the planting density, looking at changes in input or fertilizer, and various other types of adaptation scenarios. And the first goal of this project really was to look and communicate this information to farmers. But as we all know, farmers don't really care about food production in 2050. They're really concerned about food production today and tomorrow. So we had to change the approach a little bit and emphasize more the policymakers and decision makers. So in this case, it was the government of Pakistan and the government of Punjab. We know that the attention span of decision makers is very limited. So we had to condense the outcomes of 5 GCMs, 2 crop models, and 1 economic model into this 2-page brief that is shown here, which was very colorful. And this information was relayed to decision makers. And we were quite successful. And if you look carefully at the date, it's already done more than 10 years ago. But again, this was a very nice example of how we can take these very complex models, use complex climate models, input, link them to economic models, and then provide information to decision makers. So the last example I want to show is a project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This was related to cassava production in Africa. For those of you who are not familiar with cassava, it's a very challenging crop. In most cases, it grows for more than 12 months. And farmers are normally paid on the starch content of the root, not necessarily of the weight of the roots. So farmers really need to decide and determine, and decision makers as well, what would be the best planting date and what would be the best harvest date for cassava production. So in this project, our task was to use the cassava model within DSAT to evaluate different planting dates. So you can see on the left top panel, different planting months. So we basically use the model using long-term daily historical weather data, and we evaluated 1 planting date per week. And then we also evaluate different planting months. So planting after 10 months all the way up to 15 months. And again, because we have long-term daily historical weather data, we can create these box and whisker plots to come up with the right information. And this was not only done for 1 point, it was done on a grid basis, as shown on the right bottom panel. This shows the country of Nigeria and the region where cassava is being grown. So this was a very large exercise to conduct this assessment. So this required a high-performance computer to conduct all these simulations. And again, the biggest challenge is on how can we take this information and turn it into something actionable. So as part of this project, and unfortunately has already ended, they developed, again, a decision support system, andClimate, which used web-based tools and cell phone apps, retrieving information from the cloud where all these simulations were stored, and then working with NGOs and other extension agents to relay this information again to farmers. So again, this was quite a successful project because in fact I was in some of these annual meetings where we got a visit with growers and farmers, and they were very interested in this information we provided for these advanced IT tools. So then finally, and I know I'm running towards the end of my time, I'll talk a little bit more about DSAT. So again, DSAT has very limited funding. I told you we started off with $10 million funded by the US government, but since then it has been very challenging to obtain continued financial support really to maintain and then to improve these crop modeling systems. So we now emphasize, first of all, communication through what we call the DSSAT portal. And we also have a listserv where we exchange information as well. We also rely very much on capacity building and training. You can see here on the left the flyer for our upcoming workshop that will be held from May 18 to 23 at the University of Georgia, which is one of my previous employers. We've been having workshops at the University of Georgia since 2002. And the last one again was quite successful in 2025, where we had 72 participants. In addition, we also conduct workshops across the globe and actually have held 2 workshops in Turkey as well. In addition, with respect to development, we have what we call hackathons. So those of you who are working in computer programming might be familiar with that. So we get together for about 5 days, and we work on different aspects of the crop models, on the tools and application programs, and on the data. And we've been organizing these on a fairly long-term basis. The last one was just held 2 weeks ago, and we hosted it at the University of Florida. And it's now in hybrid format since COVID. And here we have a picture of the people who participated in person, but in addition, we had a similar number of people participating through Zoom from across the globe, including people from South Africa, from Germany, from Thailand, and many other countries. Also like to advertise a little bit on an upcoming book that's being published by Burley Dutz, which gives an overview of current crop models. It includes most of the dominant crop models across the globe, so not only DSSAT, but many other crop models. Unfortunately, it does not include the EPSA model from Australia, as well as the EPIC model from the United States. So are there limitations with respect to running these crop models? Yes, there are. We all know that the agricultural system is extremely complex. So in order to model it, we need a lot of scientific information. And there's still a lot of research gaps in the literature as well, as I mentioned earlier. So the current crop models, not only DSSAT, but most of the other crop models as well, can basically predict what we call potential production, water-limited production, nitrogen-limited production, and some of them can also handle more nutrients. So it's currently in DSSAT, we're working on phosphorus and potassium. One of the challenges is really how to deal with pests and diseases. And again, we are currently working within the DSSAT system, linking pest and disease modules to the crop models. Intercropping also has been a challenge, which we're now trying to address as well. And currently also there's a lot more interest in looking not only at food quantity, but also at food quality. So in some of our models now we can also predict, for instance, oil content, protein content, as well as other factors. The most challenging part really, if we talk about climate-smart agriculture and working with stakeholders, is the human decision component. This is something we cannot model, so we also always emphasize that these models don't have the final answer. We can use these models to help answer what-if questions, and then we can provide the information to our stakeholders. Again, we also need to keep in mind that these models are a mathematical representation of a real-world system. They do require careful evaluation for local conditions with local data, and they also require accurate data as input. But then once we've done that, they can become very powerful tools, as I've shown in this presentation. And again, when we want to move forward, and I think that maybe something your society is also very interested in, it's not only about the crop models per se, it's really also integrating other modeling aspects, remote sensing aspects, etc., to really provide actionable information to the stakeholders. So with that, I will be glad to answer any questions you might have related to my presentation or to DSSAT in general. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to give this presentation. Thanks again for the invitation.
We thank you for your comprehensive presentation, Professor Hoogenboom. And it's very nice to see that crop modeling can create a good economic impact, not only for future, even for now. And many people must see this opportunity to evaluate or better utilize the existing data to create better efficiency, higher efficiency for the agriculture. Now we can have questions from the participants through chat or directly they may inform us. But meanwhile, I have few questions, if possible. One of my question is from your presentation. As far as I understood or we know, the DSSAT model may utilize different types of physical parameters, chemical parameters. So it's not limited to some certain type of them. The question is, if you have a calibrated model for specific crop and the region, will it also be possible to find adapt models by using output of the other models or other type of data? For example, to be more clear, we have camera images from the observations of the phenological stage change-related monitoring systems. Thousands of seasons we have for many types of crops. But we don't have that effective, for example, soil parameter observations, such as some mineral or nutrition balances because it's a kind of varying system, time varying system. The crop itself is a time varying nonlinear system. Then the phenological stage, each phenological stage, the input output relations also vary. And this set, as far as we see here, well defines or predicts or casts and nowcasts and forecasts this relationship. Will it be possible to, for example, calibrate the model from other types of observations where you use, for example, phenological stage duration as output? We have this output, but we have some missing parameters as soil parameter or some other parameters. Will it be possible to calibrate or adapt this set model by using some of the outputs instead of more amount of input parameters?
Yes or no. I mean, we can never really replace soil inputs from remote sensing data. So, and there are many databases available which we use when a person doesn't have detailed soil information from a particular field. So, for instance, ISRIC in the Netherlands has a soil grids, which is a gridded soil database available for across the globe. So we can use that to run the crop model, say for Turkey, where you have your remote sensing data. And there are other data sources for daily weather data. But one thing which is, as I mentioned earlier, which is always challenging is having information related to local cultivar information. So yes, we can use your remote sensing data to determine the genetic characteristics of the crop for which you have remote sensing data. So for instance, if you're working with wheat, you can then parameterize the wheat parameters from your remote sensing data.
And parameterization of the seeds in the level of variety besides the crop itself is becoming important against climate smart issue. How well it is representing the variety-based changes? What's your opinion about this? Should we also consider the variety classification or choosing depending on this set model for better climate change adaptability?
Yeah, I mean, the variety characteristics have become extremely important because the breeders especially are looking at heat tolerant and drought resistant varieties. So, this is a major factor, and within the DSSAT crop simulation models, this is one of our strengths. So we have for each particular crop, and it depends on the crop you're working with within DSSAT, we have a number of what we call cultivar or variety specific coefficient that determine the number of degree days or photothermal days from emergence to flowering, and from flowering to first seed, and from first seed to physiological maturity.
In the near future, do you consider or think that breeders must also provide each variety-based parameters so that they can be utilized in crop models?
Yes, they should, but there is a somewhat of a disconnect between the breeding community and the rest of the agricultural research community. But I do know that the major breeding companies right now, they are using crop simulation models, they're using AI and many other tools to come up with better varieties. But they're not really releasing or providing the specific information required that we need in our crop simulation models.
Yeah.
This has been a huge challenge for many years. Our ultimate goal, and we haven't gotten there yet, and I think it will never happen, is that if a new variety, when it is released, if it comes with a gene map of what the genes are, and then use the gene map as direct input into a computer model.
Yeah, it can also be considered for extreme case indoor plant growth, because in all controlled condition and the conditions are all controlled. And wouldn't it be possible to, for example, not only, for example, twice the yield efficiency, but also much more than the twice regarding to some dedicated procedures that which would be optimized possibly by using the models?
Mhm. I know the breeders are using already, the companies are using these tools already.
Yeah.
So
So, what's your opinion about high performance computing nowadays? Because many business goes towards the generative AI based on platform as a service and so on. How they could make, for example, data monitoring systems to this decision maker? Will it be easier for bridging through the models? How do you see the next 10 years of model based decision making?
I see probably more integration of remote sensing with these crop simulation models.
Mhm.
I could also see that we can use generative AI to prepare input data to run the models. I could also see that we might use AI to analyze the outputs of the models and maybe even simplify the outcomes of the models as well. And maybe in some cases, we might develop an AI module to simulate a certain process and replace that in an existing crop model.
Okay.
And I also know that there are, I mean, in fact, that they've been trying to do this at least for the last 5 years, that there are many people out there who think they can use AI to predict yield.
Yeah, the
Um,
model fusion is probably will become much more important because depending on the nonlinearity rate and the time varying system conditions that interacts with many parameters, you need to anchor somewhere.
mhm.
And we don't have infinite amount of labeled data. So crop models will still be more important, probably more important than ever, even though we go towards pure AI, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that statement. So,
Okay, Gerrit, thank you very much for your nice presentation and being with us here today. If there are not any other questions, I would like to thank all the participants, and we hope to see you in the future activities too. And you are welcome to any kind of collaboration. It was very nice to hear the performance of a real model, how it works for real help of the people's decision that creates economy. So it was also not only the presentation itself to see your past experience and lifetime progress that creates the outcome of the model-based decision. Thank you very much for your all efforts.
again, thank you for the invitation. It was an honor to talk to meet you and to meet with your group. Thank you.
Thank you. Meanwhile, there was a question before we close. Probably we can take it. Bilge Arslan is asking if we simulate irrigation or another scenarios, we use seasonal file. Is it right? Seasonal X file. How the year selection should be near today or past years as 1971 to 2000 also acceptable.
Yeah. So yes, you use the what we call the seasonal application because basically this is what part of our what if scenario. So we want to set up a management regime and then evaluate a particular management regime for long-term historical weather data. Um, I think depending on really your goal and objective, I would prefer to use more recent weather data because you're especially interested to look at extremes. And I think when you talk about irrigation, you might be interested in rainfall extremes and looking at the interactions there. So if you only have 1971 to 2000, it's fine. But if you have 1990 through 2025, that would even be better.
Another question is from Ruhat Gültekin. He is wondering if there will be an integration of DSSAT model with artificial intelligence and what your perspective on this. We had a similar question, but you may answer especially to that.
Yeah, so based on the earlier question, we really haven't explored it yet, but so it's the cropping system model really is a modular model. So if you have an AI module for prediction of phenology for, say, wheat, then we can easily bring that into the cropping system model as well. So I currently don't have any examples that it will be part of DSET and CSM. We are working on generative AI and preparing input files for DSET. So for those of you familiar with Claude, which is one of the generative AIs very strong in science, if you ask for daily weather data for location you're at from maybe December 1 through January 18 and ask it in DSAT format, you'll get it in DSAT format without telling Claude what DSAT format is. So generative AI has become very powerful.
And one last comment request by Ömer Vanlı. He was our former PhD student and together with you, I guess. Thank you, Ömer, meanwhile, for connecting Gerrit to us.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank to Professor Gerrit for helping us here about academic issues, especially Ceren and Hudaverdi and I being here. We are very appreciate to help us about the academic issue. I'm working on the wheat crop yield estimation as a regional based on the climate change with PITIA and CRAFT program, and we are very going to improve about progressing on the academic problems. I just want to thank you for helping us about this agricultural issue on the Turkey. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you for deciding to visit the University of Florida for a 1 year visit. So it's been great hosting you.
Meanwhile, Professor Atala, this is last one thing, excuse us for that. He's asking the scalability versus the accuracy of the model. Have you any comment about the possible scale down to parcel level or the region or the basin level? Do you think that this set produces accurate results for all scales if it is properly adjusted, or do you have some recommendations about scale concern?
Okay. That's a very good question. It's a very challenging question. So all these crop simulation models, not only DSET, but any other ones that are out there, are basically point-based models. So we assume weather data as input, which comes from a weather station, which is really point-based observation. Soil profile, which is a point-based observation, and crop management, which is a point-based observation. And originally, yes, these models were developed to look at simulating basically experiments that were conducted. But because these are point-based simulation models, we can still apply them at a spatial scale. So, and this is all going to depend on on what type of input data you have available. So Omer just mentioned a minute ago, we have a tool called Craft, which is a Windows-based tool which allows us to do spatial simulations using a gridded approach. So within a grid, we assume we have the same weather conditions, we have the same soil conditions, and we have the same crop management conditions and the same genetics. So this grid can be 1 meter in size. If you have the weather data and soil data available at a 1 meter level, which is highly unlikely, could be 1 kilometer, could be 5 kilometer, etc. So this then allows us to do spatial scale simulations, but each simulation is conducted on a point-based, on a grid-based simulation. There is no interaction between the individual grids. So I showed you the map earlier, in fact, in my presentation of Nigeria for cassava, where we were conducting grid-based simulations at a 5 kilometer scale. Now, this still doesn't give us extremely accurate simulations for that particular location, because what is lacking is actually the knowledge of the management in a farmer's field. So this information until now is impossible to obtain because it's just a tremendous task to obtain that. But if we had for each individual farmer's field, knew his management, knew his profile, and had a weather station there, then we could simulate that, and the model would be fairly accurate, except we would not be able to simulate pest and disease interactions. So there are a lot of what ifs associated with that. However, the models will still be very strong in comparing different scenarios at a relative scale or to looking at changes at a relative scale. And again, remote sensing will become, going back to Professor Berg's earlier question, will become very critical in this aspect, because remote sensing can be extremely powerful to help us determine, for instance, not necessarily planting date, but emergent date across space, different stages, as you mentioned, across space. And then that can help us evaluate or calibrate the model to some extent for in-season yield predictions.